Sony and Microsoft are each using a custom GPU from AMD based on the company's RDNA2 architecture, but the specifics make for a major difference between the two consoles. The next-gen Xbox has a GPU performance advantage of more than 18% over the next-gen PlayStation, 12.155 teraflops for the Xbox Series X versus 10.28 teraflops for the PS5. A teraflop is the standard measure of graphics performance in terms of a GPU's ability to do a lot of math quickly. 1 teraflop is 1 trillion floating point operations per second. It's worth noting that the PS5 figure refers to peak performance. Sony went with a variable frequency GPU, with clock speeds capped at 2.23 GHz for its 36 compute units, so the system will not always operate at that maximum frequency. Lead system architect Mark Cerny did note in his presentation about the PS5 hardware that Sony expects the GPU to spend most of its time at, or close to, that frequency in performance. Meanwhile, Microsoft opted for a constant level of performance from 52 compute units, clocked at 1.825 GHz. For its part, Sony believes that its variable frequency approach will pay dividends for PS5 developers, and by extension, players. Cerny suggested that the strategy was informed partly by issues with fan noise on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro, where power consumption and thus, the volume of the fans, varied significantly from game to game. Instead of that setup, the PS5 will supply a certain amount of constant power, with the console's cooling solution designed specifically to support that particular power level, and let the frequency of the CPU and GPU vary depending on the workload. This allowed Sony to raise the GPU speed well above 2 GHz, which is unusually high. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to fully use 48 CUs, said Cerny during the presentation, speaking of the PS5 GPU and a hypothetical larger one. When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. In other words, Sony is betting that the PS5 GPU's high clock speed cap will be more developer-friendly than the Xbox Series X GPU's ability to spread computation across more CUs, despite the PS5's lower overall performance capacity in teraflops. Each next-gen console contains a custom 8-core CPU based on AMD's Zen 2 architecture, and the Xbox Series X also has an edge over the PS5 in this category, albeit a much smaller one. Microsoft chose a CPU that runs at a locked 3.8 GHz when simultaneous multithreading (SMT) is disabled, and at 3.6 GHz with SMT enabled across the 8 physical cores and 16 threads. As with its GPU, Sony opted for a variable frequency CPU, settling on a maximum clock speed of 3.5 GHz, with SMT always enabled. Microsoft expects most developers making Xbox Series X launch titles to leave SMT disabled and simply program for the 7 physical cores that are available to games. For them to go wider, for them to go to 14 hardware threads, it means that they have the system to do it, but then, you have to have workloads that split even more effectively across them, said Xbox system architect Andrew Goosen in an interview with Digital Foundry. Goosen was referring to the fact that the majority of video games these days don't take advantage of multithreading. While SMT can offer significant performance benefits, it requires more effort to optimize for it. So it makes sense that developers early in the Xbox Series X life cycle, especially those trying to get games finished for launch, would find the extra 200 MHz of single-thread CPU clock speed more immediately valuable. Horsepower doesn't mean everything, though. As we saw in the current generation, Sony was able to build a lead in console sales, largely because of the PS4's initial price. It was $100 cheaper than the Xbox One at launch, and its stable of exclusive games and content.
Thank you for watching. Like and comment. Don't forget to subscribe. Check the Patreon page link in the description. Please support on Patreon if you want.